Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com, and if you've been enjoying these 101 videos and audio, please do become a supporter over there at donate.alexmerced.com. That's donate.alexmerced.com, or become a patron at patreon.com/alexmerced. You can become a supporter for as little as $1 a month. More is appreciated, and it gives you access to an exclusive Discord group for supporters where you can meet other supporters and ask me questions, give me ideas, and get exclusive access. Now, today what I want to talk about is interest rates. So interest rates 101. What are interest rates? So that way people can understand. It all comes down to this. Today money is worth more than tomorrow money. So if I were to go up to you and say, hey, can I borrow $1? And I promise I'll give you your dollar back 3 years from now, you would just look at me like I'm crazy. Why would you wait 3 years for the dollar you already have? You have to wait 3 years, and in those 3 years, you're not able to buy $1 worth of stuff with that dollar, which you could have done if you just kept the dollar and you would have nothing to show for it. So that's what's called time preference. The idea is that you'd rather spend the money now, the same exact amount later. So you'd rather spend $1 today than $1 tomorrow. Because why not? Okay. Cool. Now you can think of situations where you may want to delay, but usually there's some sort of tangible difference between what you're giving up today versus what you're getting tomorrow. So for example, if I went up to you and said, okay, I will give you 3 years from now, I will give you a dollar, the dollar I borrowed from you back, plus an apple, you might be more willing to say yes, because you'd still have your dollar, plus you'd have an apple. Now, the dollar is not something that can be measurable, let's say, in an exact dollar amount, but essentially that difference, the fact that you pay this extra, or I paid you this extra, that's called interest. So it doesn't necessarily have to be money, but typically thought of as money. I mean, that's essentially what happened when you paid a late fee to Blockbuster. You were paying interest on borrowing the movie for longer, just at a really high rate. Okay, now, here's the deal. So what I'm doing when I pay you interest is I'm paying you to delay gratification. I'm saying, you know what, don't use that dollar right now. Use it later. Okay, because you'll get to use that dollar and then some. Now, how much I have to pay you is going to be depending on several things. Primarily what's called your time preference. The idea that how much do you really, really want to spend it now? I mean, if there's a lot of stuff that you really want, now, it's going to cost me a bit in order to pay you a high enough rate for you to delay that gratification. Vice versa, if you really can't think of anything you really want to buy, you're not in a rush to spend the money, you're going to be more flexible. You're probably going to be like, yeah, whatever, give me 1%, I'm good. You're going to be willing to accept 1% rate. But it's not just one individual. It's between sort of the equilibrium rate among everybody. Because essentially, even if you may have a high time preference, and I would have to pay you 10% to borrow money from you, there might be somebody else who's willing to lend me the money at 2%. So then I'm going to go borrow the money from them. Okay, so basically what's going to happen is that if there's a lot of people who want to borrow the money that's available to borrow, that rate's going to get bid up until you sort of hit the equilibrium or natural rate of interest. Vice versa, if there's a lot of people who want to lend money at competitive rates, that rate's going to get bid down until you hit sort of an equilibrium rate. So it's sort of a rate that represents the general time preference of society. Kind of like there's an equilibrium price for everything else. Now, different loans have different rates. So how is that the case? Well, because different loans have different levels of risk. So you start off with that sort of what you have to pay just to generally delay people's gratification, and then the fact that you're not as safe as somebody else or as some other possible borrower, so you have to pay what's called a risk premium, an additional amount based on the risk that you present over the most risk-free option that gets the actual natural rate. So now in modern times, most people use what governments borrow at as the risk-free rate of return. So essentially the natural rate of interest. Because you can lend to a government risk-free. If I lend $1,000 to the U.S. government, regardless of what the U.S. government's fiscal picture is, they can always at least print the money to pay me back my $1,000. Now, of course, that can create inflation and bubbles and all sorts of problems, but they'll give me back my $1,000. So if the government can borrow the money it needs to borrow at 3%, well, then everybody else has to pay more to borrow that same money for the same period of time. Because time is another vector of risk. The longer the loan, the more things that can go wrong. So there's your personal sort of credit risk, the likeliness that you just in general pay it back, and then there's your sort of maturity or duration risk, the risk that you may not make it because of how long it took you to pay it off. So there's all these vectors of risk, but that's what kind of alters the nominal or the actual rate of interest that people pay on different types of loans. Their personal risk, the length of the loan. These things can be offset by having cosigners who reduce the risk, or putting up collateral that reduces the risk. There's also different ways to kind of add or subtract risk to adjust that rate up and down of any particular loan. But the idea is you're generally always starting from sort of a natural rate of interest, which generally what you have to do is you have to look at sort of the risk-free lender, because if it's risk-free, the only thing that interest rate is going to be based on is the time preference of society, or the risk-free borrower. In this case, the U.S. government, typically. Doesn't mean that they can doesn't mean that there isn't any consequences of the government borrowing too much, but again, theoretically risk-free since they can print the money. So that they're going to borrow essentially at a rate that only reflects the time preference of society for the most part. Okay? Theoretically. Now, that rate is going to be competing against several other factors. People's time preference are competing versus several different choices of what they can spend their money on. So you hear Keynes talk about liquidity preference. This is the idea that which is just another way of looking at time preference, except that instead of just saying, do I want to consume now or later, they're looking at, am I comfortable enough to consume now? So in the way Keynes looked at it, when he looked at like liquidity preference, he was thinking, okay, well, there might be a time where people are scared to spend because they are scared of the future. So they're going to prefer to hold on to cash because they're scared of the future. They have a low, it's Keynes used to refer to as a propensity to consume. But that's just the same thing as saying is they have a low time preference. They don't want to spend the money now. Okay, the only difference is that one framework you're just looking at is whether their willingness to consume or not consume now, regardless of their motivation, whether it's because they're scared or there's just nothing that they want, or they have an abundance. It doesn't matter why they have a low time preference. It's just they either have a low or a high time preference. Keynes is kind of looking at a very specific situation where someone has a low time preference because of fear. So a lot of different sort of economic thinkers are looking at the same phenomena, but sometimes at different angles, and it gives a little different flavors. And oftentimes it's really a lot of what the Austrian theories or theorists and economists think about. It's a lot more like high level. So when you look at time preference, it's more of everyone has a time preference in a sense, and is regardless of motivation. It's either high or it's low. While you can have a liquidity preference is more of a function of fear, so it's more like a specific application of the idea of time preference in a sense, or looking at it through a specific situation. So that's the idea there. But then you can take a look at sort of the life cycle theory like Milton Friedman, where basically the idea is that people's expenditures, people base their decisions not based on what they have now, but based on their personal view of what they're going to have in the future. So for example, if I gave you an extra $500 right now, but you were under the assumption that I'm never going to give you $500 again, you're going to spend that $500 differently or not spend that $500 differently versus if I said, hey, I'm going to give you $500 every month. Because now you have this perception of all the future 500s. So basically the abundance that you have in your mind includes what you have now plus what you expect to get in the future, which is going to affect your time preference. Okay? And although I think Friedman phrased it more in a Keynesian framework where basically that will affect your propensity to consume. You're going to be more willing to spend money you receive now if you expect that you're going to receive more money later. So basically people's prudency is going to be affected by sort of their long-term view of their life. So a lot of this, but the bottom line is time preference is a function of individual preferences, which can be in part be affected by psychology. But the idea is that regardless of that, everyone has a time preference, a preference to consume now or later. And the interest rates are generally going to be a resulting aggregate from that difference, or that sort of equilibrium of the amount that people want to borrow versus the time preference of those who have the ability to lend. Cool. So now that we have that established, what other factors are we kind of competing against? What other things are going to affect time preference? Also, alternatives are uses of the money. So oftentimes we associate interest with debt. And if you really want to be just pure interest, I mean, technically any kind of investment, whether you're buying equity or debt, is at an interest rate. Technically, it's just that there's a lot more risk in equities, so your overall rate of return can fluctuate greatly. But you can kind of think of it as you're essentially saving money and you're generating a rate of interest based on your return on the stock. But if we were to look at equity and debt as two different things, which is going to happen is that, and we just take a look at interest as purely a function of debt, what'll happen is that as stocks, companies in the economy start performing better and they start showing higher returns, people are going to have a preference of purchasing equities for the higher returns. So you can think of that as that's increasing their time preference, since they're willing to consume equity and consume stock as a good, and that's going to end up increasing interest rates on debt. So you can either look at it as, hey, debt bonds are competing with stocks. So if stocks returns go up, interest rates are going to have to go up with it, or else I'm just going to take my money out of bonds and put it in stocks. Or you can think of it as equities as a good, and if equities are having a higher return, that's going to increase my time preference to purchase equities, which in return will still raise interest rates. Either way you look at it, you get to the same place. If equities perform well, if investments in new enterprises perform well, it's going to have a upward pressure on the natural rate of interest. And that could also be explained that basically successful enterprises are a sign of a higher time preference because people are spending their money at these enterprises. There's all sorts of different ways you get to the same place. So if the economy is doing well, interest rates are going to go up, because an economy that's doing well by the traditional metrics, growth, consumption, etc., is a sign of high time preference. And vice versa, low time preference. An economy that sort of is slowing down by traditional metrics, slower growth of GDP, generally is going to be because people are spending less, which means they probably have a lower time preference, thus rates go down. So hopefully that gives you a better idea sort of how to think about interest rates. Again, there's all sorts of other variables that affect, again, relative risks and sort of relative time preference between different areas, because people are constantly arbitraging the relative rates of different places and different lenders and different borrowers. So it's a lot more complicated in practice. But this gives you a good idea of how to gravitate thinking on interest rates. So again, my name is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com. If you guys enjoyed this, please become a patron over there at patreon.com, and consider making other donations or buying t-shirts or buying books over there at donate.alexmerced.com. Thank you guys for everything. Please do share this with friends. Have a great day and enjoy.